Mi español es insuficiente por precisión. So I will present these ideas in English, if that is okay. But thank you for being here this morning, early on our last day at the third annual conference. It was proposed that I introduce some basic ideas, concepts, and experiences that are part of the program for a new biocultural ethic. So without further ado, I'll begin. I'll give a quick overview of what we hope to accomplish, first in part by diagnosing the problem or the challenge that we face, to create a new ethical orientation in order to address the changing climate of our global world. And that involves rethinking or reconceptualizing, for which we have some tools, and then we have some basic experiences. But just a quick idea of what we'll do, and I'll try and speak as slowly as I can, but if I go too fast, please let me know. Part of the challenges that we face is the current model by which we think when we face global climate change efforts. Part of what we do at the academic universities or institutions is to try and educate, but we have a, let us say, reformulated model for what education looks like. As a professor of philosophy, as someone that takes education seriously, I like to go back ever so slightly to the etymology of education, to the Latin, which is educere, ducere being the word for to lead, but the E is the prefix in question. It means, at least in Latin, both from as well as to. And so I envision education as a journey from ourselves out into the world and then back into ourselves. Right? We start with a somewhat self-oriented vision, but then we have to learn further about the world in which we find ourselves, but then that leads back to a reformulation or a re-envisioning of how we interact with the world in which we find ourselves. Through the course of the conference, we've seen a number of themes, and so I thought I might summarize ever so slightly, is that for many of us, this has been a personal journey, but we also realize that our personal journeys are a part of a larger socio-historical journey. And so I can educate or become educated myself, wherein I learn about myself, my world, and then reimagine how I find myself in my world. But we also have to re-envision how we do so as communities, as local communities, as state communities, as federal communities, and maybe even possibly as a world community. Okay? And so we want to return to nature, that is to re-find ourselves in the world and have an ethical orientation, one that is both sustainable and can celebrate the values of biodiversity as well as cultural diversity. One small distinction that I think emphasizes this leading from, out into, and then back to ourselves is the concept of how we find ourselves in the world today. One can imagine that, say, 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, that humanity itself was operating a level of survival. But given the world of plenty in which we find ourselves today, survival isn't the singular way or the singular mode that we want to orient towards our world. So I suggest here that one of the challenges that we face is that we're not merely surviving in our world, but we are, and this is a theme that has appeared throughout the conferences, we're trying to live well inside our world. One of our keynote addresses described this as flourishing for both human beings, but also other than human beings. Animals in particular was a focus for many of the discussions yesterday. Right? Part of our systematic approach, or our biocultural ethical approach, takes its cues from the works of Aldo Leopold. And one primary idea that we find in Leopold is an expanding circle of moral consideration. He suggests that 2,000 years ago, or perhaps longer, that we were primarily interested in white, male, land-owning citizens, and those were the only people that had moral consideration. And in the mythos that he tells, we slowly expand from just simply a singular group of people to all people to all organisms, both human as well as other than human, and Aldo Leopold emphasizes that the time has arrived that we need to expand moral consideration to not just organisms, but also land. Right? Aldo Leopold famously coined the term a land ethic. And so it's a systematic and a broad and expansive way to try and understand, once again, ourselves, a personal journey, people other than ourselves, our fellow human beings, right? Other organisms within our world, right? Other than human beings, but now also the space that we occupy, the land that we live in. Okay? The chief challenges that we face is this distinction between surviving in our world, trying to find the necessities that we have in order to live, and flourishing, that is, living well. Right? I like to imagine that this is the difference between using or perhaps exploiting the world, understanding and comprehending the world as resources for our utilization, right? And appreciating and co-inhabiting the world, that is, living well, hoping, working towards our own flourishing, our own self-fulfillment, our own self-actualization, as well as the actualization of others. I also envision this as a socio-historical movement, much like Aldo Leopold does, moving from an egocentric concern, that is a personal or self-centered way of thinking, to an anthropocentric concern. This is part of the predominant discourse that we find today, right? Worrying only or exclusively about humans or human interests. One of the movements that we find that is burgeoning now is a biocentric concern, that is, all living organisms are worthy of moral consideration. However, I find this to be middle of our development. That if we go from an egocentric concern to an anthropocentric concern to a biocentric concern, the next phase in our development or our considerations would be an ecocentric concern. Not just living organisms, but also the land, the minerals, the rocks, the systems in which we find ourselves. Further development that I can envision is a cosmocentric concern, that we're worried not just about the earth itself, but maybe the place in which we find the earth in a larger system. And so ever-expanding concentric circles of consideration or moral considerability. And the last development that I envision is an ontologocentric, that is, we are now concerned about the nature as well as the consideration of all beings. Right? This could include humans, of course, obviously, other living organisms, the land in which we find ourselves, the planet on which we find ourselves, the place in the system that we find our planet, but now also, perhaps tying in with my colleague's discussion, transcendent beings or immanent beings that we have difficulty articulating. This would be the broadest and most expansive way of trying to deliberate how we work, how we interact, and how we depend on one another. One of the mantras for environmental movements that we found in the last 3 decades is that we need to raise the level of awareness. That we need to be informed and aware for moral consideration about other than human organisms. One of the things that we've noticed over the last decade or two is that simply making people aware of other than human activities, that is biodiversity, right, is insufficient. And so field environmental philosophy has decided to extend away from or beyond merely awareness to what I've decided is something like growth. We need to grow and expand our conceptual tools such that we can create experiences that will not just simply make people aware, say by watching a documentary or reading a textbook, but have concrete experiences that then transform how people understand and how people interact with themselves, their fellow human beings, other than human entities and beings, as well as the land in which they find themselves. So how do we grow is one question that I've posed. Our answer is we grow by initiating and introducing others to these transformative experiences. One of the ideas that we've seen throughout the theme of these conferences is that we have work operating through much of academia at a conceptual level. That is, philosophers, theologians, even biologists think about and describe conceptually all of the different entities that we find. Right? But simple awareness at the conceptual level is insufficient. Right? Field environmental philosophy actively works to promote a kind of emotive engagement with the environment and other than human organisms as well. And so I envision that what field environmental philosophy does is it changes our lenses, provides us new concepts on one hand, new ways of comprehending, new ways of understanding, but also providing opportunities for concrete, active experiences that then resonate with us at a level of feeling or sentiment or emotion. By combining both actions with understanding, that can lead to a transformative experience, an experience that will then reshape, that is, change the way that we see and change the way that we operate within our world. Now, how do we grow? Transformative experiences is the short answer. That is, in fact, the goal, to create opportunities for transformative experiences. Right? We need to shift and change from an anthropocentric, that is an Anthropocene way of living, and two, I'd say, dominant challenges, or two primary challenges that we face are what I'm describing here as a hegemonic dominant ideology. That is an economic lens by which we view all things as resources for human consumption. And coupled with this economic lens, we find ourselves in the midst of biocultural homogenization. Euro-phallocentric lens, that is a lens by which we view things through specific languages, through specific cultural ideologies, and through certain gendered ways of approaching the world. This has been the dominant discourse for the past 2,000 years, as we can best estimate. Some of the themes that we've seen from this conference also resonated with changing or transforming the ways that we see away from this older model, an economic model, a European model, a North American model, and that is embracing other possible views by which we can provide an interdisciplinary and intercultural engagement. Now, what I understand our challenges to be elicit a couple of needs. I've mentioned two of them, but one of them, and I think the singular and most important one, is that we need a new vision. We need a new lens by which we view and understand our world. That is, we need to have a picture. I often joke with people that philosophers don't do much, but we do one thing and we do one thing fairly well, and that is that we tell stories and we paint pictures, mental pictures. And this is precisely what field environmental philosophy has provided for us. A new picture, a new way, a new lens, one that synthesizes biological as well as cultural interactions in the formation for research experiences that can then have this transformative experience. Another theme that we've seen throughout the course of the conference is the notion of conceptual tools. So I want to embrace the notion of Homo sapiens, that is the knowing or understanding human being, as well as what I'm describing here as Homo faber, that is the making and creating. Field environmental philosophy actively works to create both experiences as well as new concepts by which we can, in fact, view the world. So I envision, and I think that field environmental philosophy envisions, that biocultural ethics is a creative activity, one that makes a new vision, a new way of seeing, as well as providing us with the tools to do so. And the remainder of my presentation is really to try and explain a few of these tools by which we re-envision or reframe the way we understand ourselves in the world as well as in the larger picture. I'll run through some of these slides fairly quickly for the purposes of time, but I hope that it's clear, and you can always ask me for the clarification later. This is a complicated diagram. I'm going to decompose it here into smaller parts. But this is a central thematic that we find in field environmental philosophy, or FEP. Notice biocultural ethics stands at the center of all of these integrated and integrating conceptual levels at different scalar levels. That is, we can work at some more basic, more experiential concepts. We can then reach out to more discursive concepts, and then we can move into systems of knowledge and ways of knowing. I'll break this down into a more simplistic picture, and then I'll return to this overarching view in just a moment. Okay. One of the most basic conceptual tools we're describing as ontological tools are ways of being in the world. And that is the way that we understand ourselves as beings as well as other than human beings. The 3 H's that FEP promotes as a conceptual tool to reformulate, right, is constituted by the intersection of the habits that we have in the spaces that we have them, the habitats, and then reformulating and understanding not merely ourselves, but all of the other inhabitants that occupy that space. Here, these images are actually borrowed from a student of ours from an exercise that we have during one of our courses, that the habitat, as it turns out, is his home. And one of the things that he does, or some of the habits that he engages in the top right corner, comedically, are going through the ordinary activities of life. Going to work, driving to work, being at home, looking outside, being somewhat of a sad fish. But these are ordinary activities, and these are the habits that we embody. When we are at home, we may engage with our fellow human beings, but we also engage with, in significant and meaningful ways, other occupants of our space, and that is our co-inhabitants. We can see them as other organisms, or even potentially landscape features, right, that participate in the habits of our habitat. The way that you engage with pets, the way that you engage with outside space, the way that you engage with gardens, right, are all part of our experience. And the significance here is that we want to view these co-inhabitants not merely as objects that we find for our utilization or use, that would be an older model, but to envision them as subjects of experience as well, who have their own subjective experience that are worth consideration and moral considerability. At the next scalar level, that is going outward, we have what I'm describing as discursive tools. We find an engagement of the biophysical with the symbolic and linguistic, as well as with the institutions that operate at socio and political levels. Right? And these intersections between the physical world in which we find ourselves, the ways that we describe ourselves, and then the institutions that we develop that are dependent upon the biophysical, as well as the ways and the languages that we use, provide another conceptual intersection that we need to be made aware of and that we need to develop conscientiously, that is moving forward with purpose. At the furthermost level, or what I call epistemological tools, is to recognize that there are more than one mode, that is more than one European or perhaps North American way of seeing things. Right? And so field environmental philosophy attempts to incorporate different wisdom traditions, or different knowledge traditions that we find throughout the world. From the philosophical perspective, we hope to incorporate less well-represented disciplines or modes of philosophy, that is pre-Socratic or underrepresented or marginalized Western philosophies. From non-Western traditions, we embrace Amerindian and indigenous knowledge systems. And we also want to incorporate contemporary scientific exploration models, that is our contemporary ecological sciences. Now I'm going to zoom back out to the larger picture. Notice that if we engage with the biophysical at a linguistic level, that is, implementing them and providing institutions that can then recognize the spaces that we occupy, the beings that occupy that space, and the way that we occupy that space, that now also include other traditions, other ways of seeing and viewing the world. We can create an ethical system that will celebrate and promote biodiversity, cultural diversity, biocultural diversity, that is, respecting and promoting all of the many different organisms and ways of seeing the world. Now these are merely the conceptual tools that field environmental philosophy has developed over the years. This is one half of the formula. Now I only have really one more slide. It is a complicated slide, but it is the methodology that we've developed over the last 20 years to provide activities that we can then use with these conceptual tools to engage with students, fellow researchers, politicians, academics, common people that come to visit different locations where we have our research activities, such that it can then provide a supplementary or secondary engagement that is the active or motive engagement, that can then truly affect a transformative experience. Right? So last slide, bear with me just a little bit longer. Right? Very complicated, but it is easily understood in terms of 4 steps. Right? The first step that field environmental philosophy promotes is interdisciplinary research. Right? That is, we take not just a singular field and pursue research expeditions, but we bring together various disciplines, often philosophers, with ecologists, with ornithologists, with bryologists, with anthropologists, with theologists. And it is by the intersection of these different disciplines that we then reframe how we will constitute our research activities. So our research itself is informed not by a singular vision, perhaps an economic or exploitative vision, right, but a vision that can celebrate these diverse cultural intersections. Once the research is conducted, one of the difficulties that we've encountered is how to communicate that information effectively. Right? Non-scientific people, right, don't read scientific manuals, technical scientific essays well. So field environmental philosophy wants to encourage communications of these research findings through symbolic and metaphorical language. Right? Simple, easy to understand, but very emotive, very emotion-laden language that can help express and communicate. It's not to oversimplify the messaging that we find in scientific or interdisciplinary research, but it is to capture our audience and to motivate them to engage with the research that is found. Once we have our research, once we have our effective metaphorical communication, we then encourage participants to create a type of activity that will be both educational as well as ethical in nature. And these activities can range from a number of different things, from simple games that we play with children, that once again have an educational but also ethical component, right, to conservation efforts, to field excursions, to visiting different places, right, to engaging with. Right? I'll provide an example in just a minute. Right? And the last step that we have, step 4, is to promote in situ conservation. Right? That is conservation in the areas that we find our research being conducted. Right? In those places that it's warranted, and we have both institutional power to do so. Right? We want to provide as much conservation space as we possibly can so that we can then promote more research activities. Right? And the research activities themselves are going to have ethical and educational implications as well. One quick example that we find in the Parte down in Puerto Williams is what we call underwater with a hand lens. Right? It is a research engagement wherein we're documenting microscopic organisms that we find in the Romolo River. Right? Part of the way that the research is engaged in is by actually removing some of the insects from the river and documenting both the age, population density, as well as the health of the river. But one of the emphases that our primary researcher, Tamara Contador, has emphasized is that rather than just simply removing the creatures from the water, killing them and taking them back to the lab, is that we can document either via photography or by visual observation and replace the organisms back in the river. So science doesn't need to kill. Science can conduct its research in an ethical way. We created this metaphor underwater with a hand lens to emphasize the changing lenses for the transformation that we need to have about our engagement in the world, that is biocultural ethics. Right? And it has in fact created, or at least has been a part of the creation of the O'Mora Park, that is our in situ conservation, as well as our Cape Horn Biosphere Conservation Preserve. Right? And so we find in the activities in Puerto Williams, with O'Mora Park, with the Biosphere Conservation, all of our 4 steps actually engaged. And one of the promising notes that we have is that when we take both researchers as well as students, and we do engage in these activities, that is, we conduct the research with our ecological and biological researchers, our students have a profound understanding and their lives are in fact changed. And so we find it to be successful to engage at the level of conceptual revitalization, that is reorientation and a changing of our mental lenses, as well as engaging with them in these activities that then give them a face-to-face encounter with other subjects of nature, other than human beings, and then they move forward and plan to and respect and reorient themselves in the way in which they find themselves. Thank you.
Muy buenos días a todos y todas. Por favor, disculpen mi bonita voz. Por lo menos hoy yo puedo hablar un poco, ayer no sé, pero de todas formas voy a tratar de compartir algunas experiencias hacia una comprensión de, como decía Ricardo, Earth Stewardship, o mejor el cuidado de la tierra, o casi siempre hemos traducido stewardship como mayordomía, pero ¿cómo es para nosotros la idea de cuidar la tierra, tanto tierra como planeta, como tierra del suelo? ¿Qué significa entonces cuidar esta tierra donde vivimos? Yo tuve la experiencia muy interesante de haber vivido en Bolivia por un buen número de años, y en mi trabajo me llevó al campo. Trabajé por medio de la Iglesia Metodista con muchos proyectos de obra rural. En eso entonces yo tuve la oportunidad de estar en el campo casi constantemente, podemos decir, sí, la filosofía ambiental del campo privilegia experiencia para comprender. Puedo decir que mi experiencia directamente especialmente los Aymara, fue una experiencia de aprendizaje de larga tiempo, ¿verdad?, que ha quedado conmigo. El transcurso del tiempo que estuve en Bolivia trabajando, también con mi esposa Janet, que algunos de ustedes conocen, siempre hemos tenido oportunidad de conocer a otros colegas, y quisiera reconocer que Judy Res está con nosotros hoy. Judy no es metodista, pero está bien. Ella tiene una larga historia de militancia en pro de la justicia en América Latina, desde El Salvador, Perú, y ya no sé cuántos años en Chile. La hemos conocido desde hace mucho tiempo, y quizás sería mejor que ella esté aquí dando la charla, pero toca a mí. También su amiga Josefina, que yo no conocí. Josefina, yo no sé su apellido, pero es un gusto. Y Janet estaba trabajando, o colaborando, o conociéndoles, mejor dicho, con las alpiñeras, que una forma artística de protesta y resistencia que surge durante la dictadura. Tiempos que quisiéramos olvidar, pero mejor que no, porque pueden regresar en cualquier momento. Entonces, siempre ha sido un privilegio, digamos, caminar con gente, otros trabajando con instituciones y trabajando también directamente con los campesinos. Y una experiencia que yo recuerdo muy bien es que uno de mis viajes al campo, al sur de La Paz, el altiplano central, como dicen, tuve que reunirme con un grupo de campesinos Aymara para hablar sobre algún proyecto que yo no recuerdo cuál era el proyecto ahora, y siempre algo que ver con financiamiento, por supuesto, pero el día fue sumamente bonito, mucho sol. Entonces el grupo decía que vayamos afuera y podemos reunirnos bajo el sol. Entonces estamos allí tomando mate de coca, una merienda, y conversando todo. Pero yo empecé a pensar, ¿dónde estamos? Y me di cuenta que estábamos en medio de un montón de estiércol de llama. Ahora, la llama es sumamente importante para los aymara. La llama es un sujeto, es parte de su vida. Se puede representar la llama en manifestaciones artísticas, entienden el feto de llama en el umbral de la casa, pueden usar partes del cuerpo de llama para fines medicinales, usan por supuesto la lana, es decir que llama y aymara van juntos y esas llamas vagan por todo lado. Y allí estábamos en medio de este estiércol. Y yo pensé, pero yo como hombre occidental estamos aquí entre la suciedad. ¿Cómo es que fue? Pero me di cuenta que para ellos no. Estiércol de llama no es nada sucio. Estiércol de llama es algo que contribuye a la vida. Es algo para celebrar, porque ese estiércol de llama que usan para fertilizar sus campos de cultivo, y sus campos de cultivo significa vida para el pueblo. Si los campos no producen, no hay vida. Entonces eso me hizo pensar, ¿qué significa entonces nuestra relación con la tierra, con los otros animales? Caso mío, con otros pueblos, con cultura sumamente diferente de la cultura mía. Me hizo pensar, quizás hay algo allí que podemos aprender cuando pensamos de la mayoría de la tierra o el cuidado de la tierra. Ahora, en esos tiempos también la llamada teología de la liberación estaba surgiendo como una manera de orientar el cristianismo hacia la justicia social. Fue una manera incluso de cambiar la manera de comprender la fe. Porque en vez de decir aquí es toda la doctrina, aquí está toda la enseñanza, mejor comenzar con la experiencia. Comenzar con las luchas de los pueblos y de allí hacer el discurso teológico, aprender desde la experiencia. Incluso Gustavo Gutiérrez, uno de los principales fundadores de la teología de la liberación, que falleció solamente hace 2 o 3 meses o menos, él siempre decía que la teología es acto segundo. Acto primero es la experiencia y la lucha. Y hay que pensar a partir de la experiencia, cómo va la filosofía ambiental del campo, y permitir que esa experiencia informa su manera de comprender, su manera de ver el mundo. Entonces, sí, dos momentos. El acto primero es estar con aymara entre su estiércol. Acto segundo, teológicamente, ¿qué significa eso? Y ese tenía mucha importancia en la manera de pensar y en alguna manera reorientó la teología desde América Latina. Yo no sé, yo creo que la teología de la liberación ya está un poco desfasado. Solamente gente con el color de pelo que tengo quizás recuerden la teología de la liberación. Con el paso de los años ha ido abriendo nuevos horizontes, podemos decir. Pero fundamental siempre para esa línea de teología que fue tan importante cuando yo estuve con los Martes en Priestierco, fue una manera de ofrecer una nueva visión y una visión integral, una comprensión que hay una sola historia, no una historia sagrada, una historia humana, sino juntos en una sola historia. Entonces, luchar por la justicia fue realmente una lucha hacia el reino. Muchas veces decimos eso. Pero él abrió nuevos horizontes que, con esa idea que siempre hay que unir o comprender el trabajo cristiano en una forma integral. En cierta manera, la teología de la liberación llega tardíamente a las cuestiones ambientales. Puede decir que aspectos ambientales brilla por su ausencia en el comienzo, podemos decir, pero hay razones por eso. Un problema que siempre yo creo que ha tenido el ambientalismo, como ha venido desde el norte, que no tenía ningún interés en el aspecto social, exclusivamente naturaleza, podemos decir. Incluso voces muy fuertes en ambientalismo, los Estados Unidos por lo menos, decía que el problema del medio ambiente son los pobres. Y el problema no es solamente los pobres, hay demasiados pobres, pero la solución no es para mejorar la vida de los pobres, es eliminar los pobres. Es muy claro en algunas de las ponencias. Entonces, en el informe muy importante, el informe de Roma en 1972, Meadows Report, no sé si recuerdan eso, dice que el problema del medio ambiente es que todos los recursos se van a agotarse. No vamos a tener más porque por el consumo excesivo. Y el problema del consumo excesivo es que hay demasiada gente. Por tanto, el discurso que acabo de decir. Unos 2-3 años después, desde Argentina, la Fundación Bariloche dice que no, un momentito. El punto de partida no debe ser el consumo y tamaño de población, hay que comenzar con la justicia social. Entonces, eliminar la cuestión de justicia social, movimientos como la teología de la liberación, diciendo, yo no quiero nada, no queremos nada que ver con eso. Ahora, se ha ido cambiando mucho y en el proceso histórico, los que luchaban en favor de la justicia social no podían evitar la realidad que el deterioro ambiental fue íntimamente relacionado y que las mismas fuerzas que oprimen la gente también oprimen el medio ambiente. Y por allí entonces se va cambiando, integrando eso. Pero una de las razones por que yo tomé contacto con Ricardo Rozzi hace años es que fue muy preocupante para mí que el ambientalismo no incluía aspecto social. Y se ve como Ricardo ha ido trabajando esa misma preocupación. Pero una cosa que también es la lectura de la teología y la vida, la Biblia desde las experiencias, o en el caso mío, el día que yo estuve con los Aymara entre el estiércol de la llama, es que puede ayudarnos a ver otros textos bíblicos que podrían ser útiles o diferentes. Ahora, en esos días que hemos estado juntos desde Puerto Williams hasta acá, se ha mencionado varias veces el primer relato de la creación en Génesis, donde los 7 días, y el ser humano tiene dominio sobre la tierra, etc. Pero hay otro relato que ni mencionamos. No sé por qué. ¿Cuál es ese otro relato? ¿Alguien sabe? Adán y Eva. Ese relato de la creación de Adán es clásicamente campesino. Es decir, que todo lo que está en ese relato se ve en las sociedades campesinas aún hasta hoy. Adán, bueno, primero es la tierra, pero la tierra no produce nada. ¿Por qué? No había agua para regar la tierra y tampoco no había nadie para cultivar la tierra. Entonces Dios crea a Adán de la tierra misma para que la tierra tenga a alguien que le cultivara. Es decir, y Adán tiene que cuidar la tierra, pero la tierra tiene que cuidar a Adán. Es decir, que es relación mutua, algo que no puede separar. Y hay animales, los animales también están hechos de la misma tierra y son los compañeros de Adán. Adán pone nombre. Algunos dicen que, claro, en la idea hebrea poner nombre es tener poder sobre, pero en ese caso no. O sea, cuando entablamos amistades, ¿qué queremos saber? El nombre. Es decir, que cuando yo conocí la mujer que es mi esposa, casi la primera cosa que yo quise saber es ¿qué es su nombre? Porque es decir, con el nombre podemos relacionarnos. Entonces Adán ya tenía nombres. ¿Dónde viene Eva? Bueno, probablemente ese relato bíblico está compuesto de 3 mitos. Primero, solamente Adán, pero eso es faltante. Entonces trae Eva. Eva, la palabra suena como una palabra hebrea que dice que vida. Entonces yo veo que ya vida y tierra se unen. Ahora, ese del árbol, ese es un tercer mito que viene luego. Es muy interesante también porque mientras que es un poco diferente del comienzo, Adán tiene que trabajar la tierra desde el inicio, pero cuando llegamos al paraíso, ya no tiene que trabajar. Eva y Adán están allí sin pensar en nada. Algo que yo no puedo imaginar, ni sabían que estaban desnudos, es decir, que no notaron nada de eso. ¿Qué tipo de ser humano es eso? Bueno, realmente eran proto seres humanos y en aquel momento se toma la decisión de la libertad. Yo voy a pensar por mí mismo. Y desde entonces ha sido todos los problemas, porque nosotros seguimos pensando en muchas formas. Pero volviendo entonces a esa idea de la mayordomía de la tierra, cuidado de la tierra, desde la comunidad aymara, estiércol de la llama, podemos ver que es otra visión. Incluso lo que llamamos mayordomía no es algo que hace, es su vida. Es su manera de convivir con. Ningún amaro podría escribir un libro sobre mayordomía. No saben qué es mayordomía. Podrían escribir un libro sobre su manera de vivir y relacionarse. Entonces, tenemos que pensar en la mayordomía siempre en ese sentido que es un estilo de vida. También los elementos que son tan importantes entre el pueblo aymara, el respeto por la tierra, el respeto por las llamas. Y otro elemento, y allí voy terminando, es evidente que la mayordomía llama entre los aymara es tan valioso que están dispuestos a defender la llama, este arco de llama, vigorosamente. Y el pueblo aymara tiene toda una historia de defender su territorio, defender su cultura, defender sus llamas, desde su defensa contra los incas, desde su lucha contra los españoles, luego contra los hacendados. Entonces, otro elemento de esta mayordomía de llamas es que cuidar la tierra no es algo pasivo o algo simplemente pensar cuán bonita es defender la tierra. Y cuando hay fuerzas que oprimen la tierra y el pueblo, hay que levantarse en contra de esas fuerzas. El elemento político y lucha social siempre está parte y parcela de la mayordomía de la tierra. Bueno, no sé, ha sido un peregrinaje muy importante para mí. Es un poco del pasado mío, pero comparto y quizás puede estimular algo de conversación. Muchas gracias.